90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. Today we're going to talk to Mark S. Gottlieb. He's a CPA and a valuation expert, and he's going to talk to us about valuations and the role they play in resolving business disputes, including divorce, bankruptcy, and sometimes estate matters. Mark, welcome to Law You Should Know.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate your invitation.
Perhaps you can tell us how you first got involved as a CPA and accountant in the role of valuations.
It's actually a very interesting story. When I was in my late 20s, I was working in what was then called the Big Eight firms. And I suffered from a disease called firstborn syndrome, which means that I was the first of three boys, and I always thought I could do anything. And when I realized that they weren't going to make a 28 or 29-year-old a partner in a Big Eight accounting firm, I decided to go out on my own, not knowing what it was really being to be a single practitioner or a practitioner in general in the field of accounting. I had a very strong auditing background, a light tax background, and when I went on my own, I started to do what I guess is now known as compliance work. I sought out clients that required payroll taxes and sales taxes and income tax returns, personal and business. And coming from a large firm, I got bored very quickly in that area. And I had subscribed to a marketing newsletter. And in the back of the marketing newsletter, there was an advertisement of a stereotypical accountant sitting behind a very messy desk with a pencil case in his front pocket and a visor on his head. And they were selling a tombstone ad or leasing a tombstone ad for accountants. And the caption said, there was a gentleman sitting behind the desk holding two phones, one in each hand. And the caption said, "Ask me why attorneys call me all year round." And that cartoon ad that they were trying to sell me inspired me to realize that there was an entirely different segment of accounting other than compliance work, other than auditing, other than tax return preparation, other than bookkeeping. And I had like an epiphany. And that epiphany was I was going to change gears and be the accountant to help attorneys in their various different types of court cases. And I do a lot of teaching now, and people say, Mark, tell us about your background, tell us what you do. And to be honest with you, it's very boring for me to spell out all the alphabet initials after my name. I frankly just tell people I am in the financial literacy business. My job now is to work with attorneys and get them through the financial maze of their court cases.
And when you're testifying in court or preparing reports for experts or one side or the other, you're using your expertise to take those numbers and analyze them and project them. And that is not as much as an exact science in black and white as accounting, but there can be different shades of gray. Different experts might interpret numbers and history different ways.
Well, that's very true, particularly in as a business valuation expert. And valuation experts often say that valuation is both art and science. There are certainly very formatted, oriented tasks associated, for example, valuing a small business for a divorce or for a gift and estate matter or for a shareholder dispute. But there's also a component that's subjective, that's very artistic. And I don't mean that in a bad way. What I'm trying to say is that certain times someone's experience and opinion has to be employed because there are certain assumptions that have to be made. And those assumptions add to the art of the exercise.
And you're also making projections based on those assumptions.
Well, I don't know how you're defining projections. And the reason I'm saying this is because I actually just testified on a case here in New York City, and it was based upon projections. And the projections were prepared by the business owner. It was my job to vet the projections. But if you're saying to make certain assumptions as far as growth and profitability and things of that nature, and using the term projection in that realm, I agree. But most experts try to avoid preparing projections as it applies to the direct results of operations of the business, because that's really management's job. That's not really the expert's job. Our job is to kind of vet that information.
So tell us about some of the types of areas of law that you're involved in, and the process that you follow in analyzing the financial details.
Sure. So there were really three types of engagements that I and my firm are retained for. The first one is business valuation. The second is some type of forensic or fraud investigation. And the third is an economic damage case. And each of those three different types of disciplines actually have three different approaches and three different reasons for the exercise. Let's take a business valuation exercise first. So generally, business valuations, as you know, are maybe required when they have to estimate or determine the equitable distribution of a business in a matrimonial action. Sometimes there's a business valuation is required when a partner or shareholder dispute is at bar, or if the business is being terminated. And then, of course, also in the event of a business owner's death, they have to file a tax return, an estate tax return, and it has to provide for the fair market value of the business, so for gift and estate tax purposes. Those are the three main reasons why valuations are required. And they all kind of start with the same premise. The first thing is you have to obtain the appropriate number of years of financial information, whether it comes from a tax return from the business or financial statements. Then you have to understand the business, and you have to describe in your report what are the valuation drivers about the business. And that also involves, quite honestly, understanding the economy and how the economy relates to the business. And then obviously you have to determine what the capitalization rate, or what lawyers like to refer to more simply as the valuation multiple. And those are just three of the three condensed steps that we go through to value the business. You know, I happen to like to tell a story when I prepare a business valuation report. Even in times when I don't need what's called a very detailed report, when the report is for litigation, like in a shareholder dispute. But I find that if you're not telling the reader, and that reader could be the trier of fact, the judge, the important parts about the business, what makes the business tick, the report's not going to make sense. Your answer's not going to make sense. And I have a very, very simple fantasy now. I'm 62 years old. I'm doing this over 33 years. And my fantasy is very, very simple. I prepare a report, and I give it to the plaintiff's attorney, I give it to the defendant's attorney, and I give it to the trier of fact, the judge. And my fantasy is that on Sunday morning, while they're having their coffee and having breakfast, and they're reading my report, they shake their heads up and down, that they understand exactly what I'm trying to say. They don't necessarily have to agree with everything that's in the report, meaning they don't have to agree with every opinion that I may present. But my fantasy is that they will read the report and they will understand my perspective and understand my reasoning and how I get to my conclusion.
And hopefully agree with your analysis and your process.
Absolutely.
Are there other experts who might use a slightly different, process or different data and come out with a different conclusion?
Well, certainly. There are many occasions in which the valuation that I prepare is materially different than the valuation another expert would prepare. And in those instances, quite honestly, we may prepare what's called a rebuttal report to itemize for the judge and for the parties a line-by-line understanding of why we have differences and why we think our report and our comments about the business are more relevant, and why our valuation conclusion is better suited or better supported. Whenever I'm in the conflict business, because much, with the exception of a gift and estate matter, much of the work that we do in our firm is litigation oriented, and it's not uncommon that there's another expert on the other side of the table who has prepared her own or his own valuation report. And I always tell the people I work with, and I even tell the judge when we're sitting and talking about the different valuations, if there's a 10 or 15% difference between two credentialed experts, you may want to just consider splitting the baby in half, because that modest difference really is responsive to the art portion of the exercise. But if there's more than a 15% difference, experience tells me that that's because there is a significant assumption or approach or methodology that is different between the two experts. And that's how I approach it.
And Mark, in a moment, I just want to talk about how you analyze those other types of disputes, but I want to remind our listeners, we're talking with Mark S. Gottlieb. He's a CPA and an valuation expert, and we're talking about the role of the valuation expert in business disputes, damages cases, and also divorces. You're listening to Law You Should Know on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York. If you missed any part of this program or you want to tell someone else about it, just go to the WHPC website at nccradio.org. Mark, you also mentioned that you analyze fraud cases. So just tell us briefly what your approach might be in analyzing a potential fraud case.
Well, we just finished a case in which the controller of a company that was involved in the food and beverage industry was stealing money from the business. And we actually spent several weeks analyzing several years' worth of bank statements and point of sale programs and various different accounting records to identify when and where the controller was stealing money. And it happened to have been a rather significant sum. And that is not a typical fraud case, but certainly it's at top of mind because we just finished working on the assignment. It obviously was a financial strain to the business owner. It was a significant amount of money. It obviously required plenty of autonomy from the employee, as well as opportunity, as well as organization, so not to be identified at its earlier stage. And so that's a reasonable example of what we've just done.
And do you also help businesses to develop safeguards and controls to try to prevent that from happening?
I'm not really in that line of work. That's, again, we do mostly litigation, so we're involved when there is a dispute and it's in court, and we don't do a lot of work that is more of a management planning. We often get asked to do it, but it's not our cup of tea. And quite honestly, it's not the type of work that we really focus on. I think that there are other types of professionals that can help business owners do that, but that's not what we do.
Okay, and you also mentioned that you analyze damages, maybe for some type of an event or an insurance claim or something like that. Tell us about what your role as a valuation expert is in analyzing damages.
Well, interesting enough, unlike many firms that do damage work that are either hired strictly by the insurance company or strictly by a business that incurred a damage, we actually get retained by both, which is a little unusual. And in these instances, it's not uncommon for us to analyze a business and try to determine what the economic damages were as a result of an event or an occurrence that either was an act of God, it could be a storm, a fire, an explosion, or it could be a business incident that occurred. So it's really it depends upon the engagement. But a typical case, that I think our audience may appreciate, suppose there was a gentleman who was a contractor and he worked with his hands and he somehow got injured and he couldn't work any longer and he put in a claim for damages because he's filing a suit against a manufacturer of the tool that may or may not have malfunctioned that caused his injury. Sometimes we're hired by the person that got injured. Other times are hired by the insurance company to analyze the books and records and determine what the actual lost earnings are or economic damages are.
And it could be damages to a business or, because of some type of contractual dispute or some type of interruption of their business.
Certainly. The example I gave was lost earnings and lost wages, but it can certainly be a business that was disrupted. I know that we just got a call. In fact, I'm testifying on a case in which a business was kicked out of its premises and it had to go out of business. And the landlord kicked them out, and the business was terminated. And they're in the process of suing the landlord for damages because they were kicked out of their premises. So it's not an uncommon occurrence, unfortunately.
And there can also be interference with a contract or with a lease that has an economic impact on one party or another, and you can analyze the economic damages because of that interference.
Absolutely. And often that may also involve, a shareholder dispute.
And what types of records do you want to look at from, let's say, the business or the aggrieved party? What type of records do you encourage businesses to generate or to retain?
Well, obviously, we start with either the financial statements or the tax returns, and to get a very precise understanding of the trends of the businesses, trends of the business activity, the revenues, the expenses, the net income. After we look at a 5 or 6 year period, and we choose a 5 or 6 year period because most financial professionals, whether they be economists or accountants or forensic accountants or finance people, we all consider a 5 or 6 year period to be what they call an economic cycle. So once you get your bearings over this economic cycle, you can pinpoint what areas you want to focus on. Sometimes we want to focus on all of the books and records, in which we will look at the general ledgers and the journals and the bank statements and the cash receipt schedules and the disbursement schedules all at once. Other times, depending upon the nature of the engagement and the size of the engagement, we only need to look at a specific area. For instance, suppose we look at a company and its legal fees were $10,000, then $60,000, $80,000, $100,000. That variance, that fluctuation in legal fees over this analyzed period lends itself to further examination. And we would look at the accounting records and the bank statements to identify why did the legal fees go up during this period.
And I just want to remind our listeners, we're talking with Mark S. Gottlieb. He's a CPA and a valuation expert, and he's talking to us about valuations and the valuations he prepares in different types of legal disputes, business, fraud, damages, and divorce or business divorce. If you missed any portion of the program, the podcast is available at nccradio.org, and you're listening to Law You Should Know here on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College. Mark, tell us about your role in other types of legal disputes, let's say a divorce case or a business divorce, and the types of information you use and what type of report you prepare.
We do quite a bit in the family law and matrimonial environment. Sometimes we are hired by the plaintiff. Sometimes we're hired by the defendant. Sometimes we're hired by the owner of the business. Sometimes we're hired by the non-titled spouse. More often than not, we are appointed by a judge to act as a neutral expert so that each party doesn't necessarily have to hire their own expert. And our job is to determine in New York State, in a divorce, it's the fair market value. In New Jersey, it's fair value. In Connecticut, it's fair market value. And different states have different standards of value. And our job is to determine what the interest is of the business owner who's getting divorced. And it's not my job to determine what the equitable distribution is. That's the judge's job. And more often than not, when we are neutral, our report is used as a tool for the parties to negotiate and settle without having to go to trial. Even when we're not appointed as a neutral, and we may be one of two experts, because maybe there's an expert on each side, there's always a hope that the experts come close enough to use their conclusion of value as a tool to settle the case. If not the entire case, at least the monetary portion associated with the equitable distribution of this marital asset, this business. So that's really a good example. And that whole process holds true in many other instances when we're hired to do a valuation of a business, whether it be a shareholder dispute or even a gift and estate issue. I've testified at the Internal Revenue Service. I've testified in federal court and in state court. And, there's always a hope that minds will come together to try to settle the case. But obviously, there are times when that's not possible.
And you most often testify in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. That's the primary, but I've testified all around the country. I've been to Chicago. I've testified in California. I've testified down south. It's not unusual that we are retained throughout the country. Most of the work that we do is, in fact, in the tri-state area, but it's certainly not exclusive to the tri-state. Okay, please give us your website and just describe what information is available to business people, lawyers, and the general public on your website.
Certainly. So our website is msgcpa.com, and it happens to be very helpful to attorneys because not only do we have the standard introduction to our firm, but we actually have resources for attorneys to help them better understand the process of valuation and forensic exercises. We have a lot of white papers, both on technical areas of this process, as well as an understanding of various industries. We have our own podcast, and I blog as often as I can, and the blog is on the website as well, and the blog tries to attend to areas that I feel that the lawyers will appreciate and get a good understanding of what the actual concept is that we've chose to write about.
And we just have a little time left in the program. Just offer some tips on the do's and don'ts for lawyers and business people in choosing and using valuation experts.
Well, first of all, in choosing an expert, you obviously want to choose an expert that is credentialed. Although there are many CPAs throughout the country, and particularly the tri-state area, not all CPAs are credentialed valuation experts. I happen to have several accreditations in valuation and forensic accounting, and that is what the lawyers and the courts want to see when you propose an expert. So the first thing is get someone who's credentialed. The second item is is find someone who already has had the experience of being accepted as an expert in court. It's not just good enough to have the credentials after your name. You have to have, it's prudent of the lawyers to seek a professional who has already been admitted as an expert in the court, particularly if you're in a specific area of expertise. And then obviously, it goes without saying, don't hire an expert or don't look to hire an expert at the 11th hour. It's very, very difficult to do a complete and thorough job, maybe even almost impossible, if you're hired with a very short window to do your work. So I often, when I teach, and I think I may have mentioned I'm an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School here in New York City, and when I speak to my students, and then when I speak at the bar associations, I try to emphasize, get your ducks in a row early on in litigation. Try to get your expert lined up so that your expert can help you get the documents or identify the documents that are required and allow them the proper amount of time so they can do their work and give you the type of product that will help you resolve the case.
And also you can help guide the lawyers in conducting their depositions, what are important areas to prepare for and also to question about.
Well, I'm gonna tell you a little dirty secret about me, okay?
Yeah, just very briefly.
Yep. I will never, ever again go into direct examination without giving a lawyer all the questions he or she should ask me. Whether they use them word for word or not, I don't care, but I always give them my direct examination. And just as important as that, I make sure that they give me the time and the ability to help them with the cross-examination of the other expert.
Okay, I'd like to thank our guest, evaluation expert and CPA, Mark S. Gottlieb. If you missed any part of the program, you want to tell someone else about it, just go to the website, nccradio.org, and please join us next week at this same time for another program on Law You Should Know here on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College.